We need to move into your guest house. That's what my father said, standing on my doorstep with my mother beside him, both looking at me with an expression I'd seen countless times before, that mixture of expectation and entitlement, as if my resources had always been theirs to claim. I stood there in the entrance of my home, my six-bedroom estate in an exclusive neighborhood outside Seattle, and felt something crack open inside me, not with anger exactly, but with the sharp clarity of perfect irony. The guest house. They wanted the guest house. I remembered with sudden visceral detail the last Thanksgiving just 2 years ago, when I'd driven 6 hours to their place in Portland and been told I'd be sleeping in the garage because all the real bedrooms were taken. Not the guest house, because they didn't have one. The garage. The actual garage, with its concrete floor and smell of motor oil and lawn fertilizer, where they'd set up a camping cot and a space heater that barely worked, where I'd shivered under a thin blanket while my brother Derek and his wife Ashley slept in my childhood bedroom, the one that used to be mine before they'd converted it into their permanent guest suite. My mother shifted her weight on the porch, clutching her purse. "Emma, did you hear your father? We really need to talk about this." Her voice had that edge of impatience, the same tone she'd used when I was 12 and asked why Derek got a new bicycle while I got his old one repainted. I'm 34 now, a tech entrepreneur who sold her company for $47 million, and I'd thought somehow that success would change how they saw me. But standing there, watching my father's eyes scan the visible portions of my home with something between resentment and calculation, I realized that some patterns run too deep for money to dissolve. I thought about that garage, about the way my father had said, "It's actually quite nice we put a space heater out there," as if he was doing me a favor, about how I'd heard them telling relatives at Thanksgiving dinner that I didn't mind, she's always been low maintenance, their voices drifting through the door while I sat on that cot in my coat because the temperature had dropped to 35 degrees. I thought about my brother Derek, the golden child, who'd never spent a single holiday anywhere but the best bedroom in whatever house we occupied, whose mediocrity had always been celebrated while my achievements went unnoticed, who was probably right now sitting in his apartment that I suspected our parents were still partially funding. And now they wanted my guest house, the beautiful 1,200 square foot space with its gourmet kitchen and luxury finishes, the place I'd designed for actual guests, for people who'd always seen my worth. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern started so early I can barely remember a time before it, back when I was 7 and Derek was 9, when I brought home my first report card with straight A's, and my parents nodded absently while they hung Derek's art project, a lopsided clay bowl, on the mantel like it belonged in a museum. I remember standing there with that report card in my hand, the paper crisp and new, decorated with stickers my teacher had carefully placed beside each perfect grade, and my mother said, "That's nice, sweetie," without looking up from where she was arranging Derek's bowl, adjusting it 3 times to catch the light just right, and my father said, "Emma's always been good at school. It comes easy to her," as if my hours of careful study were somehow less valuable because I didn't struggle, as if achievement that looked effortless required no effort at all. Derek got the bigger bedroom, the one with the window seat and the built-in shelves, while I got the smaller room that had been a sewing nook. And when I asked why, my father said, "Your brother needs more space. He's got all his sports equipment," even though Derek quit soccer after 3 weeks and basketball after 1 season, while I kept my books stacked in careful piles because I had only one small bookshelf. I wore Derek's hand-me-downs sometimes, his old jeans with the knees worn out that my mother would sew patches over, telling me they were perfectly good and wasteful to replace, while Derek got new clothes every season from the department store, shopping trips I wasn't invited to because "you're so easy, you don't care about fashion." When I was 10, I started a dog-walking business in our neighborhood, making flyers on our old computer and charging $5 per walk, and I saved $237 in a shoebox under my bed, proud of every bill and coin. And my parents said, "That's Emma, always industrious." But they didn't say it like a compliment, more like an observation of something curious and slightly concerning, the way you might note that a cat had learned to open doors. Derek got a new gaming system for Christmas that year, something he'd mentioned wanting exactly once, while I got books, which I loved but which cost a fraction of the price, and when I noticed the disparity, I told myself that I was lucky to get anything at all, that maybe I was just easier to please, that maybe my parents were right and I really didn't need as much. I learned to shrink my needs, to solve my own problems, to achieve not for recognition, but because something in me couldn't stop reaching for more. Some engine that ran on internal fuel rather than external validation. And maybe that was the greatest gift and the deepest wound they gave me. That self-reliance that looked like strength, but was really just a child learning that she couldn't count on anyone else to see her. College was supposed to be my escape, my chance to prove myself in a place where achievement actually mattered. And I worked 3 jobs to pay for it. Because when the acceptance letters came, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and told me they could contribute $2,000 total, just $2,000 for all 4 years. And I nodded and said thank you. Because I'd already learned not to expect more, already knew that asking for what Derek received would be met with explanations about how different situations required different solutions. I worked as a barista from 5 to 9 in the morning, attended classes until 3, tutored students in math and science until 6, and spent weekends doing data entry for a local insurance company. And I was so tired that first year that I sometimes fell asleep in the library with my face pressed against my economics textbook. But I made it work, paid my tuition at the state school, covered my books and rent, ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, and told myself that this struggle was building character, that someday I'd be stronger for it. Derek, meanwhile, went to Chapman University, a private school in California with pristine lawns and small class sizes, tuition $45,000 per year, and my parents paid every cent, $180,000 over 4 years before he dropped out. And when I saw those numbers later, when my mother mentioned them casually during a phone call as if they were just normal family expenses, something hardened in my chest like cooling metal. I came home for Christmas my sophomore year, and my father asked how school was going, and I told him about my 4.0 GPA and the business fraternity that had invited me to join, and the professor who wanted me to help with her research. And he nodded and said, "That's good, Emma. Just make sure you're having fun too. College isn't just about grades." And then he turned to Derek and asked about his classes with genuine concern in his voice, with real engagement, even though Derek had just admitted he was failing 2 courses and might be on academic probation. I started a side business my junior year, building simple websites for small companies in the area, charging $300 for basic sites and up to $1,200 for more complex ones. And within 6 months, I was making more than I made at all my other jobs combined. And I was proud, genuinely proud, thought maybe this would be the thing that made my parents see me differently. But when I told them about it over spring break, my mother said, "That's nice, honey, but when are you going to get a real job, something stable with benefits?" And my father said, "These internet things are just a fad. Make sure you have a backup plan." Derek dropped out junior year, just stopped going to classes and stayed in his apartment playing video games. And when my parents found out, they drove down to California and brought him home and told relatives he was taking time to figure out his path and exploring his options. And I watched them make excuses, watched them protect him from consequences, and part of me wanted to scream that I'd never had the luxury of exploration, that I'd been working since I was 10 years old. But I didn't scream, didn't say anything, just went back to school and worked harder and built my little business, and told myself that someday, somehow, my work would speak louder than their favoritism ever could. I graduated at 22 with a degree in computer science and a job offer from a tech company in San Francisco, $95,000 a year, more money than I'd ever imagined making. And I called my parents with the news expecting something. Some small acknowledgement that their daughter, who'd worked 3 jobs and lived on ramen, had done something remarkable. But my father said, "That's good, honey. San Francisco is expensive, though. Make sure you budget carefully." And my mother said, "Will you be able to come home for holidays?" And that was it. The sum total of their response to what felt like my entire validation as a human being. I was 26 that first Christmas after I'd established myself in my career, had proven I could make it in the competitive tech world, had earned a promotion to senior developer and a raise to $112,000, and I flew home with gifts I'd carefully chosen, expensive things I could finally afford, a cashmere scarf for my mother, and a leather briefcase for my father, and when I arrived at the house I grew up in, the house where I'd had the small converted sewing room, I found that my childhood bedroom no longer existed as I'd known it. Derek had moved back home after dropping out of college and drifting through a series of restaurant jobs he always quit after a few months, and my parents had converted my room into his game room, filled with expensive gaming equipment and a massive television and a leather recliner. And when I stood in the doorway looking at the space where my bed had been, where I'd studied late into the night and dreamed of escape, my mother said, "Derek needed a space of his own, and you're only here a few days a year. It didn't make sense to keep it empty." They'd made up the couch for me in the living room, brought down a pillow and one of the thin blankets from the hall closet, while Derek, 28 years old and unemployed, slept in the master guest suite with the attached bathroom and the comfortable queen bed. And when I asked why I couldn't take the other guest room, the smaller one, my father said, "Derek's got his stuff in there, his overflow gaming equipment. It would be too much hassle to move it all for just a few days." Christmas morning, I woke up on that couch with my back aching and my neck stiff, and I watched my parents give Derek a check for $5,000, an investment in his latest idea, something vague about starting a gaming YouTube channel, while they gave me a $50 gift card to Target. And my mother said, "We figured you're doing well now, you don't really need anything." And I smiled and said thank you, because that's what I'd learned to do. And I sat there in my wrinkled pajamas with my aching back and watched Derek talk excitedly about his plans that would never materialize while my father listened with genuine interest. And something crystallized in my mind, like ice forming on a winter window. I needed to do more than succeed. I needed to build something so undeniable, so substantial, that even they couldn't overlook it. And on the plane back to San Francisco 2 days later, I opened my laptop and started sketching out the idea that had been forming in my mind for months. A project management platform that used AI to optimize team workflows. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was going to be the thing that changed everything, even if I couldn't yet imagine how completely it would transform my life. I was 27 when I started building what would become Flow State Technologies, and I kept it secret from my family like a woman hiding a pregnancy she wasn't sure would survive to term, because I couldn't bear the thought of my mother's concerned questions about why I was wasting time on another internet thing, or my father's well-meaning advice to focus on my stable job instead of chasing dreams. I worked from 5 in the morning until 8, putting in 3 hours on my startup before my regular job started, and then I'd come home at 6 and work until midnight, surviving on coffee and determination and the absolute certainty that I was building something that mattered, something that would change how teams collaborated and communicated. The apartment I rented in San Francisco cost $2,000 a month, and it was tiny, a studio in the Sunset District where fog rolled in thick and gray. But I barely noticed because I was hardly ever there, and when I was there, I was coding or designing or testing or pitching to potential investors who mostly said no. I ate rice and beans and chicken I bought on sale, wore the same rotation of clothes I'd had since college, drove a 13-year-old Honda Civic that burned oil and made concerning noises, and every spare dollar went back into the company, into the AI platform I was building that could analyze team communication patterns and automatically optimize project timelines and resource allocation. My parents called every few weeks and asked when I was going to settle down, get married, maybe buy a house. And my mother always mentioned that Derek was dating someone new, someone serious this time. Maybe I should try one of those dating apps since I was clearly too busy with work to meet anyone naturally. I missed Thanksgiving that first year because I was preparing for a pitch meeting with a potential client, and I missed Christmas because I was debugging a critical feature, and my mother's voice on the phone was tight with disappointment when I explained I couldn't make it. And she said, "Derek will be so sad not to see you. He's bringing his girlfriend Ashley. We think she might be the one." I was 29, 2 years into building Flow State, when I landed the contract that changed everything, a project management deal with a healthcare consortium that needed to coordinate across 17 hospitals in 4 states, and they signed a 3-year contract worth $2.3 million. And I sat in my tiny apartment looking at the executed contract on my laptop screen and cried, actually cried, because this was proof, undeniable proof, that what I'd built had real value. I didn't tell my parents about the contract because I knew what they'd say, something about how nice it was that my little side project was working out, maybe followed by a reminder that Derek was getting serious with Ashley, and they were thinking about getting engaged, and I was tired of measuring my achievements against their indifference. So I just kept working, kept building, kept growing the company that they didn't even know existed. Derek called on a Tuesday in March, when I was 30 years old, and Flow State was valued at $12 million according to the venture capital firm that had been courting me for a potential acquisition, and his voice on the phone had that quality of forced excitement that I recognized from every major announcement in his life, the tone that said he expected celebration regardless of whether he'd earned it. "Emma, I proposed to Ashley. She said yes, we're getting married in November." And I made the appropriate sounds of congratulation while feeling absolutely nothing except a distant curiosity about how much this wedding would cost my parents and whether I'd be expected to contribute despite never having been invited to a single family planning session for any major event in the last decade. The answer came 2 weeks later when my mother called to tell me that I'd be a bridesmaid, that the dress I needed to order cost $500 plus alterations, and that they were so excited to have both their children celebrating such important milestones, as if Derek getting engaged at 30 was equivalent to me building a company from nothing while sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 years. I ordered the dress, a champagne-colored monstrosity that would look terrible on me, and I sent the check for $500. And I didn't mention that my company had just signed its second major contract worth $4.7 million, or that I'd been featured in TechCrunch's 30 Under 30 list, because I'd learned that my achievements existed in a separate universe from my family's awareness, parallel lines that would never intersect. The wedding planning happened around me and without me, a flurry of group text messages that I was added to but never really included in, conversations about flower arrangements and color schemes and venue selections that were already decided by the time I saw them, and when I offered to help with anything, my mother said, "Oh, honey, you're so busy with work, we don't want to burden you," which was code for, "We don't actually want your input." I flew home the week before the wedding in mid-November, telling my assistant I'd be unreachable for 7 days, and I packed nice clothes and the bridesmaid dress and gifts I'd bought for Derek and Ashley, expensive things from their registry, because at least I could show generosity, even if they'd never show me genuine inclusion. When I arrived at my parents' house on that gray November afternoon with my suitcase and my carefully wrapped gifts, my mother hugged me briefly and said, "Oh, good, you're here. We've got you all set up. Derek and Ashley are in your old room, and Ashley's parents have the master suite, and the bridesmaids are sharing the 2 guest rooms, so we've made up a nice space for you in the garage." And she said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if she'd just told me I'd be staying in a perfectly normal bedroom instead of the place where they parked their cars and stored their holiday decorations. I followed my mother through the kitchen, where wedding preparations covered every surface, past Derek and Ashley, who were laughing about something on Ashley's phone and didn't look up when I walked by, and out the side door that led to the garage. And when my mother opened the door and gestured inside with what I can only describe as forced cheerfulness, I saw exactly what my sleeping arrangements would be for the next 7 days. The garage had been converted in the most minimal sense possible, which meant they'd moved one car to the driveway and pushed the other to the far side to create a space approximately 10 feet by 12 feet. And in that space, they'd set up a camping cot, the kind with thin nylon fabric stretched over a metal frame that I recognized from my Girl Scout days 20 years earlier. And on the cot was one pillow that looked flat and old and a single blanket, the kind of thin fleece throw that you'd use while watching television, not for sleeping through November nights when temperatures in Ohio dropped into the 30s. The floor was bare concrete, gray and cold and stained with old oil spots, and the walls were unfinished drywall that my father had installed years ago and never painted. And there was one small space heater in the corner, an ancient model with a frayed cord that looked like a fire hazard, and my mother pointed to it and said, "See, we made sure you'd be warm. That heater works great." And her voice had that bright quality that people use when they're trying to convince you that something terrible is actually fine. I stood there with my suitcase feeling the cold radiating up from the concrete through my shoes, and I could see my breath in the air. And I thought about the master suite where Ashley's parents would be sleeping in my parents' king-sized bed with the memory foam mattress my mother had bragged about buying last year. And I thought about my old bedroom where Derek and Ashley would be staying. The room that used to be mine with its attached bathroom and soft carpet and windows that actually had curtains instead of the one small garage window covered in grime. "It's actually quite cozy once you get the heater going," my mother said, and she was already backing toward the door, already leaving before I could protest or ask questions or point out that this was insane, that no one should ask their 30-year-old daughter who'd flown across the country to sleep in a garage on a camping cot. And I opened my mouth to say that maybe I should just get a hotel room, that this was too much, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the part of me that still wanted to be the good daughter, the low-maintenance one who didn't cause problems or make demands, or maybe it was the sick curiosity about whether they'd actually go through with this, whether they'd really let me sleep in these conditions for an entire week while everyone else had comfortable beds and heat and dignity, or maybe I just wanted to see how far their favoritism would go, to gather this evidence of their disregard, like I was building a case that I'd present someday when I had the strength. "It's fine, Mom," I heard myself say, and she smiled with relief and said, "I knew you'd understand. You've always been so flexible." And then she was gone, the door closing behind her, leaving me alone in the garage with my expensive suitcase and my bridesmaid dress, and the growing realization that I meant so little to my parents that they'd housed me like an afterthought, like someone who didn't matter enough to deserve basic comfort or consideration. That first night in the garage, I turned on the space heater and watched it glow orange for 30 minutes before I realized it was barely producing any warmth, the cold seeping up through the concrete floor and settling into my bones while I lay on the camping cot fully dressed in jeans and a sweater and my winter coat. And I didn't sleep more than 2 hours that whole night, listening to the wind rattle the garage door and thinking about Derek and Ashley, probably tangled together in my old bedroom with its working radiator and soft mattress, and the comfort of knowing they were valued. The week that followed established a pattern that would crystallize in my memory as the definitive proof of my place in the family hierarchy. A series of small exclusions and casual cruelties that my parents didn't even seem to recognize as such because they'd become so normalized in the way they treated me. There were morning breakfasts in the dining room, where the bridesmaids and Ashley's family gathered for elaborate spreads my mother had catered, pastries and fresh fruit and hot coffee, and I'd emerge from the garage cold and exhausted to find them already eating. No place set for me, my mother looking surprised when I appeared as if she'd genuinely forgotten I was there, saying, "Oh, Emma, help yourself, there might be some leftovers in the kitchen." There was the rehearsal dinner venue tour that everyone attended except me, because no one thought to tell me when they were leaving. And I came back from a coffee shop where I'd gone to escape the cold garage to find an empty house, and a text from my mother sent an hour earlier saying, "We're at the venue, see you at dinner tonight," as if it hadn't occurred to her that I might want to be included in the pre-wedding activities that the other bridesmaids were experiencing. There was the incident with the wine, the moment that crystallized Ashley's contempt and my parents' complicity, when I'd brought a bottle I'd carefully selected from a wine shop in San Francisco, a $200 Napa Valley Cabernet that the sommelier had recommended for special occasions, and I'd presented it at dinner 2 nights before the wedding, offering it as my contribution to the celebration. And Ashley had picked up the bottle, examined the label with this expression of dismissive amusement, and said, "Oh, we prefer quality wines, but thanks anyway, I'm sure someone will drink it." And she'd set it aside like it was cheap grocery store wine, while my parents said nothing, didn't defend me or correct her or even acknowledge the rudeness. And I'd sat there feeling my face burn with humiliation, while Ashley poured everyone glasses from a bottle my parents had bought, a $30 wine from Costco that she praised effusively. I spent most of my meals that week eating alone, sitting at the kitchen counter with a plate I'd fixed myself from whatever remained after everyone else had been served, and I could hear them in the dining room laughing and bonding and creating memories that didn't include me. And I told myself it was fine, that I was used to being peripheral, that I just had to get through the wedding, and then I could go back to San Francisco and my real life where I was valued and successful and seen. 6 months after Derek's wedding, I returned home for Thanksgiving, and this time I had information that my family didn't possess. Knowledge that sat in my chest like a secret weapon I wasn't yet ready to deploy, because timing mattered, and I wanted to choose the perfect moment to reveal what I'd become. My company had sold 3 weeks earlier for $47 million, a number so large I'd stared at the wire transfer confirmation for 20 minutes, trying to make it feel real. And after taxes and investor payouts, I'd personally cleared $31 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to never work again if I chose. Though I had no intention of stopping because the work itself had become part of my identity in a way that family never had. I hadn't told my parents about the sale because every time I'd mentioned my company over the past few years, they'd responded with polite disinterest or thinly veiled skepticism. My mother once asking if I was sure I shouldn't look for something more secure, and my father suggesting that tech startups were risky, as if I were a child playing with matches rather than a 32-year-old woman building something substantial. I'd planned to tell them over Thanksgiving, had imagined a quiet moment when I could share my success and finally see recognition in their eyes. But when I arrived at their house on Wednesday evening, I discovered that the garage had become a permanent fixture of my visits home. My mother opening the side door and saying, "Your room is all ready," as if she'd prepared a guest suite, rather than directing me to the same camping cot and space heater I'd endured during the wedding. They'd even put my name on it, a small wooden plaque screwed into the garage doorframe that said Emma's room, in cheerful script that made me feel sick. This official designation of my status as the child who raided concrete floors and camping equipment, while Derek and Ashley occupied my childhood bedroom with its comfort and warmth, and the implicit message that they deserved better. Thanksgiving dinner the next day was the moment that crystallized everything, the scene that would replay in my mind for months afterward as the definitive proof that my parents would never see me clearly, without undeniable evidence of my worth. I'd emerged from the cold garage that morning after another sleepless night to find the dining room table set for 8, the good china and crystal glasses arranged beautifully. And when I'd moved toward the table, assuming I'd help finish setting up, I'd realized with a jolt that there were only 8 place settings for 9 people, and my mother had gestured to a folding card table set up near the kitchen door, the kind of flimsy table you'd use for children or overflow guests. And she'd said, "We ran out of room at the big table, but you'll be cozy over there." I'd served myself last after everyone else had filled their plates with turkey and stuffing and all the dishes my mother had spent days preparing. And I'd carried my plate to that card table and sat by myself eating, while 10 feet away, my parents and Derek and Ashley's parents, and my Uncle Jim sat at the real table, laughing and passing dishes and creating the warm family scene that apparently didn't include me. I was sitting there cutting my turkey when I heard my father's voice carrying from the dining room, talking to Uncle Jim in that jovial tone he used when he was holding court, and he said, Derek's got that new consulting opportunity in Chicago, really going places, and Emma's still doing her tech thing in San Francisco, never really launched into anything major, but at least she's stable, pays her bills. And I'd felt something crack inside my chest, this final breaking of whatever hope I'd still carried, that they might see me without me forcing them to look. I flew back to San Francisco the day after Thanksgiving and spent the entire flight looking at real estate listings on my laptop, searching neighborhoods I'd always admired but never thought I could afford. Places like Pacific Heights and Presidio Heights, where the homes had views of the bay and gardens that didn't feel like you were still in a city. And I realized with a strange sense of displacement that I could now afford any of them, could pay cash for properties that would have seemed like impossible fantasies just months ago when I was still grinding away at the startup, wondering if the sale would ever happen. I started touring houses the following week, walking through estates with my realtor Jennifer, who'd initially seemed skeptical of my budget until I'd shown her my bank statements and watched her entire demeanor shift into the focused attention reserved for serious buyers with serious money, and we looked at 12 properties over 10 days before I found it, the 6-bedroom estate in Presidio Heights that had everything I'd been envisioning, without quite knowing I was envisioning it. The main house was beautiful, a renovated Mediterranean-style home with high ceilings and huge windows that let in cascades of natural light, hardwood floors and a chef's kitchen, and a master suite that took up the entire third floor. But what made me know this was the one was the guest house, a separate structure at the back of the property that was 1,200 square feet, with its own full kitchen and 2 bedrooms and luxury finishes that made it nicer than most standalone homes. And I'd stood in that guest house looking at the marble countertops and heated bathroom floors, and thought about the garage with its concrete floor and camping cot and space heater that barely worked, and I'd felt something settle into place inside me, some final piece of a decision I'd been making without realizing it. The asking price was $3.4 million, and I'd offered $3.2 in cash with a 3-week close, and the sellers had accepted within 6 hours because cash offers with quick closes are impossible to refuse. And just like that, I owned an estate that would have taken my parents 40 years of combined salaries to afford. A home that made their house look modest and ordinary and small. I'd hired an interior designer named Claire, who specialized in modern luxury, and given her a budget of $400,000 to furnish the entire property, and she'd transformed it into something that belonged in Architectural Digest, all clean lines and comfortable elegance, and the kind of understated wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it was obvious in every detail. While the house was being furnished, I'd started my venture capital firm, setting up an office in Soma, and beginning to deploy capital into early-stage startups, and I'd discovered that I loved this work even more than running my own company, loved finding brilliant founders who reminded me of my younger self and giving them the resources and guidance to build something meaningful. And within 2 months, I had 8 investments in my portfolio and a growing reputation in the San Francisco tech scene as someone who understood both the technical and business sides of building companies. I moved into the house in early November and spent weeks just walking through the rooms, feeling like I was living in someone else's life. And then I'd begun planning for Christmas, deciding that this would be the moment I'd finally show my family what I'd built, not out of spite or revenge, but out of a deep need to be seen clearly, to present them with evidence so undeniable they couldn't dismiss it, or minimize it, or fail to recognize what I'd accomplished entirely on my own, without their support, or encouragement, or belief. I called my mother on December 3rd, exactly 3 weeks before Christmas, and told her I wanted to host the holiday at my place this year, my voice deliberately casual as if I were inviting them to a normal apartment rather than an estate they couldn't begin to imagine, and I could hear the surprise in her voice when she said, "Oh, well, we usually host here, but I suppose that would be nice. Where are you living now?" I gave her the Presidio Heights address, and she repeated it back to me with a slight hesitation in her voice. That neighborhood name clearly registering as expensive but not yet connecting to the reality of what expensive meant in San Francisco real estate. And she said, "That's a nice area. Is it a good-sized apartment?" And I had smiled to myself, standing in my chef's kitchen, looking out at the garden, and said, "It's adequate, plenty of room for everyone." And I'd felt that small flutter of anticipation, knowing what was coming, knowing that in 3 weeks they would drive up to this address and have every assumption they'd ever made about me completely shattered. Derek had called me 2 days later, his tone carrying that familiar mix of condescension and false brotherly interest, and he'd said, "Mom told me you're hosting Christmas, finally going to see Emma's studio apartment. Should we bring sleeping bags in case there's not enough floor space?" And Ashley had laughed in the background at his joke, and I had let the comment sit there for a moment before saying simply, "Just bring yourselves, I have plenty of space." And I hadn't elaborated or defended or explained, because the explanation would come soon enough in a form they couldn't dismiss or minimize or make jokes about. I'd spent the next 2 weeks preparing the house with an attention to detail that went beyond normal holiday decorating, hiring a professional company that specialized in luxury Christmas installations, and watching as they transformed my home into something that belonged in a magazine spread. A 16-foot tree in the 2-story foyer decorated with hundreds of white lights and elegant gold ornaments. Fresh garland wrapped around the staircase railing, tasteful wreaths on every door, and a subtle sophistication to every element that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. I'd hired a catering company that normally served tech executives and venture capitalists, the kind of operation that cost $5,000 for a single dinner party. And I'd worked with them to create a Christmas Eve menu that would be unmistakably high-end, dishes with ingredients my parents had probably never heard of, prepared by a professional chef and his team, who would arrive hours before dinner to handle everything in my commercial-grade kitchen. This wasn't about showing off or making them feel small, I kept telling myself as I approved flower arrangements and reviewed the wine selection. This was about finally being seen clearly, about presenting evidence of my worth that was so undeniable they would have to acknowledge what I'd built. And if part of me enjoyed imagining their faces when they saw the house, then I figured I'd earned that small satisfaction after years of garage floors and card tables and being told I'd never really launched. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, and I'd dressed carefully in cashmere and wool that looked effortless but had cost more than my parents probably spent on clothes in a year, and I'd walked through my home one final time checking that everything was perfect before standing at the front window, watching the street for their arrival, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit, because this moment had been building for years, decades really, and finally it was here. They arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, and I watched from my front window as my father's aging Honda pulled up to the curb and stopped, watched as he leaned forward over the steering wheel to look up at the house with an expression I couldn't quite read from this distance. Confusion, maybe? Or disbelief? And then my mother got out of the passenger side and stood on the sidewalk staring at the Mediterranean facade with its tall windows and professionally decorated exterior. And she turned back to say something to my father that made him check the address on his phone before looking back at the house again. Derek's Mercedes pulled up behind them, and he climbed out with Ashley, both of them stopping short when they saw the estate. And I watched Ashley's face go through several expressions in rapid succession, shock and disbelief, and something that looked almost like anger. And Derek stood very still, just staring. And my mother walked back to them, and I could see her mouth moving, probably asking if they had the right address, probably wondering if I'd somehow given them wrong directions to bring them to this neighborhood, where homes cost millions, and people like us didn't belong. I let them stand there for another 30 seconds, let them process what they were seeing, and then I opened my front door and walked down the stone pathway to the gate, and my mother's eyes locked onto me with such naked confusion that I almost felt sorry for her, almost, and my father said, "Emma, we must have the wrong address. We're looking for your apartment." And his voice carried that assumption that this couldn't possibly be mine, that there must be some reasonable explanation for why I'd brought them to this estate. I smiled and opened the gate wider and said, "No, you have the right address. Welcome to my home." And I watched those words land on them like physical blows. Watched my mother's hand come up to her throat in that gesture she made when she was truly shocked. Watched my father's face cycle through confusion and disbelief and something else I couldn't name. And Derek just stood there silent, while Ashley said in a voice sharp with accusation, "This is your house?" I nodded and gestured toward the front door and said, "Come in, I'll give you a tour before dinner." And they followed me up the pathway, moving slowly like people in a dream. And when we stepped into the two-story foyer with its 16-foot Christmas tree and curved staircase and original hardwood floors, I heard my mother make a small sound in her throat, almost like a whimper. And my father stopped just inside the door and said, "How can you afford this, Emma? Is your boyfriend rich? Did you marry someone?" And I turned to face them all standing there in my entranceway, looking lost and small, and said clearly, "No boyfriend, no husband, I bought this myself, paid cash." And I watched my mother reach out to touch the wall as if she needed to confirm it was real. Watched her eyes move over the crystal chandelier and the fresh flowers in the enormous vase on the entry table and the view through to the formal living room beyond, and she was examining everything with the intensity of someone looking for proof of fraud, searching for evidence that this couldn't actually be mine. And Derek hadn't said a single word since entering, just stood there with his hands in his pockets staring at everything, while Ashley's face had settled into an expression of open hostility that she wasn't even trying to hide. I guided them through the foyer into the formal living room, where I'd had the catering staff set up coffee and appetizers on the antique coffee table I'd bought at an estate sale in Pacific Heights. And I gestured for them to sit on the custom sofas that had cost $18,000. And once they were all seated, looking awkward and out of place in this room that spoke of wealth they'd never imagined I possessed, my father leaned forward with his hands clasped and said in a voice that carried both confusion and something harder, almost accusatory, "Emma, you need to explain this. Where did the money for this house come from? What exactly is going on here?" I sat down across from them, in the wingback chair that faced the fireplace, and took a breath. And I said calmly, my voice steady, because I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times. I started a company 4 years ago, a project management platform that uses artificial intelligence to optimize workflow for tech companies and large corporations. I built it from nothing while working my regular job, and 2 years ago, I left my position to run it full-time, and last year, I sold that company for $47 million. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that I could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantel and the distant sound of the catering staff working in the kitchen, and my mother's face had gone completely pale, all the color draining out of it as if I'd told her someone had died, and my father just stared at me with his mouth slightly open, and I continued because the numbers needed to be specific, needed to be concrete enough that they couldn't dismiss or minimize them. After taxes and paying out my two co-founders and early investors, I personally cleared $31 million, and I've since started a venture capital firm that invests in early-stage tech companies. And between my existing investments and the VC firm's returns, I currently have a net worth of approximately $39 million and an annual income of around $2.1 million. My mother made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and my father said, "That's not possible. You never told us about any company. You said you worked in tech. You never mentioned." And his voice trailed off, because he was realizing even as he spoke that they'd never asked, that in all our phone calls and brief holiday visits, they'd never once inquired about the specifics of my work, beyond the most superficial questions. And I reached for my phone and pulled up the Forbes article that had run last month, the one titled, 30 Under 35, Tech Entrepreneurs Reshaping Industry. And I handed the phone to my father, watching as he stared at my photograph and the headline and the paragraph describing my company's innovative approach and successful acquisition. He passed the phone to my mother with shaking hands, and she looked at it, and then at me, and then back at the article, and she said in a whisper, Why didn't you tell us? Why did you keep this secret? And Derek finally spoke, his voice rough and strange. You never told us. And I looked at my brother sitting there next to his wife, who'd made jokes about my cheap wine, and said quietly, You never asked, Derek. In 4 years of building this company, 4 years of working 18-hour days and risking everything, not one person in this family ever asked me what I was actually working on, or whether it was going well or if I needed anything. You all just assumed I was doing something mediocre because that's what you'd always expected from me. The catering staff served dinner at 7 in the formal dining room at the table that seated 12, and I'd set it beautifully with the china I'd bought from the estate collection and the crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. And we sat down to a meal that had cost more than my parents used to spend on groceries in a month: filet mignon and roasted vegetables and truffle mashed potatoes and a wine I'd selected specifically because it cost $300 a bottle, and the silence was so thick I could barely breathe through it, everyone eating mechanically and not tasting anything. And I watched my mother cut her meat into tiny pieces she barely touched, and my father drink his wine without seeming to notice what he was drinking, and Derek just stared at his plate like he was seeing it from very far away. And finally, he set down his fork and said, his voice carrying an edge of something defensive and sharp, This doesn't change anything, you know. Money isn't everything. Having all this doesn't make you better than us. And I felt something shift in my chest because, of course, that's where his mind had gone, to competition and hierarchy, instead of to the years of dismissal that had brought us to this moment. I set down my own fork very carefully and looked at him and said, my voice calm, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't let anger drive this conversation. You're absolutely right, Derek. Money isn't everything, which is exactly why it hurt so much to sleep in the garage. And my mother's head snapped up, and she said quickly, too quickly, her voice taking on that defensive tone she always used when confronted with something uncomfortable. That garage was perfectly adequate, Emma. We put a space heater out there and a cot. You're being dramatic about something that wasn't a big deal. And I felt the words hit me like they always had. That dismissal of my experience. That insistence that my pain wasn't real or valid or worth acknowledging. I took a breath and said, still keeping my voice level, Let me tell you about some things that were a big deal. Let me be specific so there's no confusion about what I'm talking about. And I began listing them, each one a small knife I'd been carrying in my chest for years. Derek's college tuition, room, board, and expenses, $180,000 over 4 years, even though he dropped out junior year. My college support, $2,000 total for 4 years, while I worked 3 jobs and graduated with honors. And my father interrupted, his face flushing red. Derek needed more support. He wasn't as self-sufficient as you. We were helping him find his way. And I nodded and continued because I'd expected that justification. Derek's wedding that you spent $75,000 on while asking me to contribute $500 for my bridesmaid dress. My childhood bedroom that you converted into Derek's game room while he lived at home unemployed at 28, and I visited once a year from my job in San Francisco that paid $95,000. I continued listing them because each one needed to be said aloud and witnessed. Derek's wedding expenses of $75,000 that you paid in full, while you asked me to contribute $500 for the bridesmaid dress I wore in his wedding. My childhood bedroom that you permanently converted to Derek's gaming room, while I was living 2,000 miles away working my first real job. The guest room incident when I came home for Christmas at 26, and you put Derek in the master suite while I slept on the couch, even though he was unemployed and living with you rent-free. And my father started to interrupt, but I held up my hand because I wasn't finished, and I needed to say all of it while I had the courage. The $5,000 investment you gave Derek for a business idea he described on a napkin compared to the $50 gift card you gave me that same Christmas when I'd just landed a $95,000 job. The Thanksgiving dinner 6 months ago when you put me at a card table in the corner while Derek and Ashley sat at the main table. The garage where you made me sleep during Derek's wedding week when it was 35 degrees outside. I paused and looked at my mother, who had tears running down her face. And I said very quietly, very clearly, "You put my name on the garage door. You made a little wooden sign that said, 'Emma's room,' and hung it out there like it was a joke. Like it was funny that your daughter's place in this family was a converted garage with a space heater and a camping cot." And my mother said through her tears, "We didn't realize you were upset, Emma. You never said anything. You always seemed fine with everything." And I felt something break open in my chest, because that was the core of it, wasn't it? The fact that I'd learned so early not to complain or ask for anything, because asking meant being disappointed. I leaned forward and said, my voice shaking now but still steady enough to be heard, "You didn't realize because you didn't look, Mom. You didn't ask. You didn't wonder why I stopped coming home for holidays, or why my visits got shorter every year, or why I never called just to talk. You didn't look at me long enough to see that I was hurting because you were too busy looking at Derek." And Ashley made a sound, something scornful and dismissive, and she said, "Oh, please, this is so melodramatic. You're a successful woman now. Why are you dwelling on ancient history?" And I turned to look at her, this woman who'd made jokes about my wine and dismissed me at every turn. And Derek surprised me by saying, his voice sharp, "Ashley, don't." But she continued, "She's clearly just trying to make everyone feel guilty because she has money now and wants attention." And I stood up from the table, my hands shaking, and I said very calmly, "I think you all need to leave now. This evening is over." And my mother said, "Emma, please," reaching for my hand. And my father said, "We're sorry. We didn't understand. We can talk about this." But the apologies felt hollow and reflexive. Words said because the situation demanded them, rather than because they'd truly understood what they'd done. I walked to the foyer and opened the front door, letting in the cold December air. And I waited while they gathered their coats. And my father stopped in front of me and said, "I'm sorry, Emma. I truly am. We made mistakes." And I nodded, because I believed he believed that. But I also knew that understanding the full weight of those mistakes would take more than one uncomfortable dinner. And I watched them walk to their cars, Derek helping Ashley with her coat, while my mother cried and my father put his arm around her, comforting her for the pain of hearing what they'd done to me. And I closed the door and stood in my beautiful house that I'd bought with money I'd earned, and felt utterly alone. 6 months passed, in what felt like both an eternity and a single breath, and I spent them learning what my house could feel like when it was filled with people who actually wanted to be there. Friends from work who exclaimed over the architecture and meant it. Colleagues from the venture capital world who understood what I'd built and respected it. Women from my networking group who sat in my living room drinking wine and talking about their own struggles with family expectations and feeling unseen. I hosted a dinner party in February where 12 people sat around my table and laughed and argued about politics and told stories, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard genuine laughter in this space. And I had friends stay in the guest house, a couple from college who spent a weekend and left a note saying it was the most beautiful place they'd ever stayed. And slowly the house began to feel less like a monument to my success and more like an actual home. My parents and I exchanged exactly 4 text messages in those 6 months, perfunctory holiday greetings, and my mother asking once if I was okay, to which I responded, "Yes, thank you," and nothing more because I didn't have the energy to build a bridge they'd already burned. Derek called twice, conversations that lasted less than 5 minutes. His voice strained and careful, like he was talking to a stranger he'd accidentally offended. And I was cordial but distant because I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine, and I knew he wasn't ready to do the actual work of addressing what had happened. Then in June, early on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing investment proposals in my home office, my phone rang with my father's number, and I almost didn't answer it, my finger hovering over the decline button, but something made me pick up, maybe curiosity or maybe the tiny stubborn part of me that still hoped for something different. He asked if we could meet for lunch, his voice formal and uncomfortable. And when I asked if something was wrong, there was a long pause before he said, "Your mother and I need to talk to you about something. It's important." And I felt my stomach drop because that tone meant crisis. I'd heard it exactly twice before in my life, once when my grandmother died, and once when my father had a health scare that turned out to be nothing. I agreed to meet them at a restaurant halfway between my house and their place, a chain Italian restaurant they liked that I found aggressively mediocre, and I spent the 2 hours before the lunch trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming, cancer or divorce or something with Derek, running through scenarios and my potential responses. They were already seated when I arrived, both of them looking older than I remembered, my mother's hair grayer and my father's face more lined, and they stood awkwardly when I approached the table, and my mother tried to hug me, but it was stilted and brief, and we sat down and ordered and made small talk about the weather and traffic, until finally my father cleared his throat and said, "Emma, we need to tell you something. We're in a difficult financial situation." And I watched his face as he explained, his hands fidgeting with his napkin, how they'd taken out a second mortgage on the house 18 months ago. How Derek had come to them with a business opportunity that seemed promising, something about importing specialty goods or consulting, or honestly the details were vague even as my father described them. And they'd given Derek $85,000 as an investment, and the business had failed within 4 months, and Derek couldn't pay them back because he and Ashley had their own expenses, and now the bank was foreclosing, and they had 60 days to sell the house or lose it entirely. My mother was crying quietly, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, and my father said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "We were hoping, we thought maybe, we could move into your guest house, just temporarily, just until we get back on our feet." And I felt the world tilt sideways, because the audacity of it, the sheer assumption that after everything, after the garage and the dismissals and that disaster of a Christmas dinner, they could ask me this, that they could come to me, requesting shelter in the very guest house I'd built with money they'd never believed I could earn. And I sat there staring at them while the server brought our food, and I couldn't remember what I'd ordered. I sat there looking at my parents across the table in this mediocre Italian restaurant with its too bright lighting and laminated menus, and I said, my voice steady and quiet, "I need time to think about this. I can't give you an answer right now." And I could see the panic flash across my mother's face and the frustration tighten my father's jaw, because they'd expected me to either say yes immediately out of obligation or no out of spite. But they hadn't expected me to actually consider it carefully, to treat it like the serious decision it was. I paid for lunch, even though my father reached for the check, and I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. And I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in my home office, staring out the window at the guest house, that beautiful 1,200 square foot structure with its craftsman details and high-end finishes, trying to separate what I wanted to do from what I felt obligated to do, from what would actually be healthy for everyone involved. I called my therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman I'd started seeing 4 months earlier after the disastrous Christmas dinner, and I got lucky because she'd had a cancellation and could see me that evening, and I sat in her calm office with its soft gray walls and told her everything, the foreclosure and the request and the $85,000 they'd given Derek that they'd never even considered offering me. And she listened the way she always did, fully present and non-judgmental. And then she asked me what I was afraid would happen if I said yes, and what I was afraid would happen if I said no. I realized I was afraid that saying yes would mean falling back into old patterns, becoming the dependable one who gets taken for granted, the strong one who doesn't need anything. And I was afraid that saying no would mean carrying guilt for the rest of my life, wondering if I'd been cruel, if I'd used my resources as punishment rather than help. And Dr. Chen nodded and said, "What if there's a third option? What if you could help them, but with boundaries that protect you? What if you could offer support without sacrificing yourself?" And something clicked into place, because I'd been seeing it as binary, as either complete openness or complete closure, when maybe the answer was something more nuanced. We spent the next 40 minutes talking about what healthy boundaries would look like, what terms would allow me to help without enabling the old dynamics, and I drove home feeling clearer than I had in days, and I spent that night drafting a list on my laptop, detailed and specific, the conditions under which I'd be willing to let them move into the guest house. 3 days later, after I'd reviewed the list a dozen times and revised it and sat with it and made sure it was truly what I wanted, I called my father's cell phone, and he answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety, and I said, "I've thought about your request, and I'm willing to let you and Mom move into the guest house, but I have conditions that are non-negotiable." And there was a pause before he said, his voice careful, "What kind of conditions?" And I read from my list, clear and firm. "You'll pay $800 per month in rent, which is significantly below market rate, but enough that this is a transaction rather than charity. The arrangement has a firm 6-month limit, at which point you'll need to have found other housing, and all three of us will attend family therapy sessions twice a month with a counselor I'll help you find." And there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear my mother's voice in the background asking what I'd said, and my father finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Family therapy seems extreme, Emma. We can work through things ourselves." And I felt my resolve strengthen because this resistance was exactly why the therapy was necessary, and I said, my voice steady, "Those are the terms, Dad. All of them are required. If you're not willing to agree to all three, then the answer is no." And there was another pause, longer this time, muffled conversation I couldn't quite hear, and then my father came back and said, "Okay, yes, we agree. When can we move in?" They moved in on a Saturday in late June, my parents arriving in a rental truck because they'd already sold most of their furniture to pay down some of their debts. And I watched from my kitchen window as my father made multiple trips carrying boxes and suitcases into the guest house, my mother directing him with hand gestures, and I'd furnished the space for them ahead of time, spending $4,000 on a new bedroom set and living room furniture and kitchen essentials because I wanted them comfortable, but I also wanted to establish from the beginning that this was my property and I was setting the terms. I'd had a locksmith install a separate entrance code for the guest house that was different from my main house, a small but significant boundary, and I'd sent them an email the week before with what I called the house rules, specific and detailed. They needed to text before coming to the main house. We'd have dinner together every Sunday at 6 in my dining room. They were responsible for their own groceries and cooking, except for those Sunday dinners, and we had our first therapy appointment scheduled for the following Tuesday at 4 o'clock. The guest house really was beautiful, nicer than anywhere they'd lived in the past decade, with crown molding and hardwood floors, and a kitchen with granite counters and stainless appliances, floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room that looked out onto the garden, a master bedroom with an ensuite bathroom that had heated floors and a rainfall shower, and a second bedroom I'd set up as an office space with a desk and bookshelves. And when my mother texted me that evening asking if I wanted to come see how they'd settled in, I walked over and knocked, even though it was technically my property, maintaining the boundary of treating it as their space during the 6 months. They'd unpacked most of their boxes, and my mother had arranged framed photos on the mantel, pictures of Derek's wedding and his college graduation, and family photos from when we were children. And I noticed there wasn't a single photo of me alone, only group shots where I appeared in the background. But I didn't say anything, because therapy would be the place for those conversations, not this first evening when everything was still fragile and new. My father thanked me, his voice formal and uncomfortable, and my mother cried and tried to hug me, and I let her briefly before stepping back and reminding them about Sunday dinner and the therapy appointment, and I walked back to my main house feeling strange and unsettled, looking back at the guest house with its lights glowing warm in the evening, these people who'd given me so little now living in luxury I'd provided. That first Sunday dinner was awkward, all of us sitting at my dining table with the meal I'd catered from a local restaurant, passing dishes in near silence. And my mother kept complimenting the house and the food in a way that felt performative, and my father asked careful questions about my work that felt like he was trying to understand who I'd become when they weren't looking. The first therapy session that Tuesday was even harder, sitting in Dr. Chen's office in 3 chairs arranged in a triangle, and she'd asked us each to describe what we hoped to gain from these sessions, and my parents had given vague answers about improving communication and being closer as a family. And when it was my turn, I'd said, my voice steady, I want them to understand how their favoritism affected me, and I want to know if they're capable of seeing me as I actually am, instead of who they assumed I was. And the silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable until Dr. Chen gently asked my father to respond to what I'd said, and he'd cleared his throat and said, his voice quiet, we always thought Derek needed us more. He was always struggling with something, and you were always so capable, so independent. And I'd felt tears burning in my eyes as I said, I needed you too. I just learned not to ask. It was month 3 of my parents living in the guest house, and we'd settled into an uneasy rhythm of Sunday dinners and twice-monthly therapy sessions where small truths were emerging like buried stones slowly surfacing through soil. When Derek called me on a Tuesday evening in late September, his voice shattered in a way I'd never heard before, and he said, Emma, can I come over? Ashley left me, and I felt a complicated knot of emotions tighten in my chest. Pity and vindication and old sibling protectiveness all tangled together, and I said yes and gave him the gate code. He arrived 20 minutes later, driving his expensive BMW that I knew he was probably 3 payments behind on, and when I opened the door, I barely recognized him. This golden child who'd always moved through life with unearned confidence, and now his eyes were red and swollen, and his hands were shaking as he stood on my porch, and I stepped aside and let him in, leading him to my living room, where he collapsed onto the couch and started talking, words tumbling out about how Ashley had been having an affair with a venture capitalist she'd met at some charity function, how she'd told Derek he was a disappointment, and she'd married him thinking he had potential, but he'd turned out to be nothing, how she'd packed her things yesterday and served him with divorce papers this morning. And I sat in the chair across from him listening and watching my brother fall apart in my house, in this space I'd built with the strength he'd never thought I had. I could have felt satisfaction, could have said something cutting about karma or consequences, but instead, I heard myself saying, I'm sorry, Derek. I know you loved her, because despite everything, he was still my brother, and his pain was real, even if it was partially self-created. And he looked at me with something like wonder and said, Why are you being nice to me? I've been terrible to you our whole lives. And I felt my throat tighten, because this was the first time he'd ever acknowledged it directly. I asked if he had somewhere to stay, and he shook his head, said their apartment was in Ashley's name, and she'd changed the locks. And before I could fully think it through, I heard myself offering him the second bedroom in my main house, this ironic reversal where I was giving him the space I'd been denied so many times, and he started crying harder and said he didn't deserve my kindness. And I said quietly, Maybe not, but I'm offering it anyway. We talked until after midnight, sitting in my living room with the lights of the city visible through the windows, and Derek told me things he'd never said before, how he'd always felt like a fraud, how the pressure of being the favored child had been its own kind of prison because he could never admit he was struggling without disappointing everyone. And he said something that cracked my heart open, his voice raw and honest. You were always so strong, Emma. You never needed anyone. I didn't know how to be that. And I realized he'd mistaken my survival for strength and my silence for contentment. And I told him the truth about the loneliness and the nights I'd cried myself to sleep and the years I'd spent trying to earn love that should have been freely given. And I watched his face change as he understood that my independence hadn't been a choice, but a necessity. The next morning, my parents saw Derek's car in my driveway and knocked on my door, concern etched on their faces, and I invited them in and explained briefly what had happened, and they asked if Derek could stay in the guest house with them instead. And I saw Derek's face close off in old patterns before I said firmly, He's staying here with me. You two have your space, and this is mine to offer. And something shifted in the room because my parents were watching me extend grace to the brother who'd been chosen over me again and again, and I think they were finally beginning to understand what strength actually looked like. The 6 months mark arrived on a cold Saturday in early December, and my parents had found a modest two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood 30 minutes away, a ground floor unit in a complex with a small patio, and they'd saved enough from the $800 monthly rent I'd charged them to cover their deposit and first month's rent. And on their last Sunday dinner before the move, my mother carried in a wrapped package that she set in front of me at the table, her hands trembling slightly. And when I opened it, I found a framed photograph I'd never seen before, me at age 12 standing next to my science fair project about renewable energy, wearing an oversized blazer and a smile so wide and hopeful it made my chest ache. And I was completely alone in the photo, no parents flanking me with proud expressions, no family members in the background, just me and my project and my unguarded joy. And my mother said quietly, "I found this in a box in storage. We didn't go to the fair that day because Derek had a baseball game, and looking at it now, I can see your face and how much it mattered to you, and we weren't there." And my father cleared his throat and said, his voice thick with emotion, "Emma, I need to say things I should have said years ago, specifically and clearly, not the vague apologies I've been hiding behind." And he listed them one by one, the college money disparity, and how they justified it by saying Derek needed more support, when the truth was, they'd just assumed I'd be fine, the garage sleeping arrangements, and how cruel it was to prioritize everyone's comfort over mine, the countless times they'd dismissed my achievements because they were too busy managing Derek's failures, the way they'd made me feel invisible in my own family. And he said, "We failed you as parents. We failed you as people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, and you succeeded not because of us, but despite us, and I'm so deeply sorry." My mother was crying openly now, and she said, "We thought we were helping Derek by giving him more, but all we did was teach him he didn't have to try and teach you that your efforts didn't matter. And watching you with him these past months, seeing how you offered him grace when he'd never earned it, it's shown us the kind of person you became when we weren't paying attention, and we're so sorry we missed it. We're so sorry we made you feel like you had to be perfect to be seen." I cried then, really cried, tears streaming down my face as I held that photograph of my 12-year-old self who'd had no idea how long she'd wait to hear these words, and I said, "I accept your apology, and I want you in my life. But the boundaries stay, the therapy continues, and you need to understand that I'm not doing this because I need you anymore. I'm doing this because I want to." And they nodded, and my mother reached across the table to hold my hand, really hold it. Not the performative gestures from before, but genuine connection. And my father said, "We'll do better. We'll keep doing better, for whatever time you'll give us." They moved out the following week, and Derek had been living in my guest room for 2 months by then, working at my venture capital firm in an entry-level analyst position that I'd created for him. And he was actually good at it when he stopped trying to fake competence and started asking questions and learning. And he'd apologized to me multiple times in different ways, through words and actions, and the quiet respect he now showed for my boundaries. And I'd helped him find a therapist of his own because I understood that being the golden child had damaged him differently, but just as deeply, and our relationship was becoming something real and mutual instead of the twisted dynamic of our childhood. The Sunday dinners continued, my parents driving over from their apartment every week, and slowly we were building something that resembled a healthy family. Not perfect but honest, not without tension but with genuine effort. And I was learning that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and boundaries didn't mean rejection, and that I could be generous without being a doormat and strong without being alone. Now it was late November again. Almost exactly 2 years since that Thanksgiving when I'd sat at the card table in the garage, and overhead my father tell my uncle I'd never really launched, and I was hosting Thanksgiving dinner at my house, the real Thanksgiving I'd dreamed of, and my parents arrived early to help with preparations. My mother setting the table in my formal dining room with the china I'd selected, my father arranging flowers in vases, and Derek showed up with the wine. Good wine that he'd researched and chosen thoughtfully, and we all moved around my kitchen together, talking and laughing and working as a team. And when we sat down to dinner, we were all at the same table. No card table in the corner, no garage exile, just family around my table in my home that I'd built with my own strength and determination. After dinner, I walked through my house alone for a moment, looking out the windows at the guest house with its lights off and its rooms empty. And I thought about how I'd imagined filling it with my parents out of desperation, and how they'd lived there out of necessity, and how now it sat waiting for actual guests, for friends who'd always celebrated my success, for colleagues who respected my work, for people who'd seen my worth long before my family finally opened their eyes, and I realized that my worth had never been determined by their recognition, that I'd built this life and this success and this strength entirely on my own. But having their recognition now, genuine and hard-won, and accompanied by real change, brought a peace I hadn't expected. Not the validation I'd once desperately needed, but the quiet satisfaction of being truly seen. I heard laughter from the dining room, my family's voices blending together, and I walked back to join them, and the guest house sat empty behind us in the darkness, ready now for people who'd always known what my family was finally learning. That worth isn't given by others but recognized, and some people see it immediately, while others take years to open their eyes, and I'd waited long enough to know the difference between the two.